Good afternoon, everyone. It's very, very good to see everybody here. I'm Linda Brady, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, and it's my absolute privilege to welcome you to this very special event at the University. This is one of a number of events that we are hosting to celebrate our 90th anniversary at this campus in Ormskirk. And this week we are also celebrating International Women's Day to recognise the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women in society. And there could be few more fitting women to help us celebrate this than Lady Hale of Richmond. It's 5 years since Lady Hale became an Honorary Doctor of Law of the University in recognition of her trailblazing career in the legal profession. And it's a privilege to once again welcome you to the University, Lady Hale, for this In Conversation event in which Lady Hale will offer a glimpse of her truly remarkable life and career, which is characterised by many firsts. Lady Hale grew up in Richmond, North Yorkshire, the second of three sisters, the daughter to two head teachers. And from an early age, her parents were an inspiration through their determination to ensure that their daughters got a good education. Lady Hale, presumably just Brenda then, took the 11 plus exam a year early, already demonstrating her tremendous intellect. And she attended a small local grammar school for girls. Lady Hale continued to flourish in her education, and she became the first student from her school to be offered a place at Cambridge. She obviously studied law at Cambridge, and this was at a time where only three colleges in Cambridge were admitting women. And she was one of only 6 women in a cohort of over 100 men. Unsurprisingly, for those who have since followed her career, she came top of her class, graduating in 1966. Following graduation, Lady Hale began a career in academia, teaching law at the University of Manchester whilst she qualified and practised as a barrister. During this time, she again broke new ground, publishing on family law and mental health, and writing books such as the highly influential Women and the Law in 1984. Also in 1984, Lady Hale became the first woman and the youngest person ever to be appointed to the Law Commission. She went on to spend 9 years with the Commission and was integral in several important reforms, including, crucially, the introduction of the Children Act 1989, which she believes has stood the test of time pretty well, which I think is probably quite an understatement. In 1994, Lady Hale became a High Court judge in the Family Division, and in 1999 she followed Dame Elizabeth Butler-Sloss to become only the second woman to be appointed to the Court of Appeal. Despite being a trailblazer for very, very many women herself, Lady Hale is full of praise and gratitude for those such as Dame Elizabeth who paved the way for her. Lady Hale became the first female Lord of Appeal in Ordinary in 2004, and then became the first female Justice of the Supreme Court in 2009. In 2013, Lady Hale became Deputy President of the Supreme Court, a post which she held until 2017, when, inevitably, I think, she continued in her long line of firsts and became the first female President of the Supreme Court. Upon her appointment, her predecessor, Lord Neuberger, praised Lady Hale's intellect and humanity with which she approaches the appeals which come before her, and he described her appointment as a fitting pinnacle to a truly groundbreaking career. Throughout her illustrious career, Lady Hale has always demonstrated her commitment to equality and diversity, seeking to ensure the interests of children are paramount and tackling the violence and discrimination that women can often face throughout their lives. During her time as President of the Supreme Court, Lady Hale also argued for greater diversity within the judiciary, not only to address gender inequality, but inequality born of ethnicity and, as she terms it, more broadly, for those who have lived less privileged lives. Perhaps most famously, it was during Lady Hale's tenure as President that the Supreme Court found former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament to be unlawful, a ruling which Lady Hale described as a source of not pride but satisfaction. And so say all of us, I would say. In 2023, Lady Hale was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Women of the Year Awards, and she is featured in very diverse publications, including Vogue, of course, and is frequently and appropriately described as an icon of the legal world. Despite the dizzying heights of her career and deserved recognition, Lady Hale continues to set time aside to be an outstanding role model to future generations, regularly visiting universities and speaking to young people and sharing her wisdom from her illustrious career in the service of society. I'm sure I speak for us all when I say it's an absolute huge privilege to have you join us today, Lady Hale, to share your insights, and please welcome me in welcoming Lady Hale.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for the introduction, which actually covers most of the ground I was going to talk about. So I should... Okay. And it is a real pleasure to be back here in Edge Hill. I have the happiest memories of the day when I was awarded an honorary degree here and was driven around your beautiful campus in a golf buggy by two delightful law students who were obviously thoroughly enjoying their time here. It felt like a very happy place. And you look like quite a happy bunch of people too, so that's great. So congratulations on your 90th birthday. I look forward to coming back to celebrating your centenary in 10 years' time. God willing, yeah. But of course there is no such thing as a free honorary degree, is there? No, any more than there's a free lunch. One is always going to be invited back to do a term. And I was asked to talk about myself. Now, that's a risky thing to ask an elderly person like me to do, because we've got so much to say that we risk banging on, but I'll try not to. Anyway, I'll say something about me and my career, something about diversity in the judiciary and the legal profession, and something about the Supreme Court, if that's okay. So, as you've heard, I grew up in rural North Yorkshire, near the ancient town of Richmond, the real one, after which all the other 100-plus Richmonds in the world are directly or indirectly named. I went to the village Church of England primary school and then on to Richmond High School for Girls, another state school. As you've heard, my father was headmaster of a small independent boys' grammar school, and my mother was a trained teacher, but she had to give up work when she married my father in 1936 because in those days, married women had to give up teaching. It's worth remembering, isn't it? There were marriage bars in quite a lot of the public sector between the wars. But she ran the boarding house at the school and she did some teaching there. They were both very involved with the church. My father was a lay reader and he used to fill in for the local clergy when they were either sick or on holiday, and he had a bank of 100 sermons and he had a card index which told him where he had preached each of these sermons so that he didn't repeat himself in any church, which I suppose is a systematic thing that all teachers ought to do anyway. But he died very suddenly when I was 13, and my younger sister was 12, and my mother dusted off her teaching qualifications, picked herself up, she was absolutely devastated, as were we all, and got herself a job as head teacher of that same village primary school where my sister and I had been. It meant we could stay in the same village, at the same school, with the same friends. So she was my first wonderful female role model. And it taught me early on the importance of education, of qualifications, and of being able to stand on your own 2 feet, no matter what happens. And it was a very different world in those days. The village was very different. There was only a handful of professional incomers like us, the vicar, the doctor, and the teachers. Most of the people living there were farmers, farm workers, or local tradesmen. So we were unusual. And we were unusual in that it was taken for granted that all 3 Hale sisters would go to university if we could. This is a time when only 2.5% of young women in the 18 to 21 year age group went to university. Think of that. Double that proportion of young men went to university. Think of that. But we all did. I sometimes wonder whether our parents' expectations would have been different if one of us had been a boy. But I think not. They were a very, very egalitarian couple. And as you've heard, I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge. Not only the first from my school to go to Cambridge, but the first to study law. And I'm fond of saying that I chose to study law because my headmistress did not think I was clever enough to study history. Don't know about that. In those days, we did say that those who weren't clever enough to study history studied law. Now it's the other way round, of course, but there we go. But history was my best and favourite subject at school. What she actually said was she didn't think I was a natural historian. But I had already developed a fascination for British constitutional history. And so I suggested law. It was nothing to do with Perry Mason or, jury trials, the drama of the court or anything like that. No, it was to do with the drama of the 17th century. I must be one of the very few people who studied law because of the drama of the 17th century, but you should think about it. Very important. Now, to her great credit, my headmistress did not say nonsense. Girls don't do law, or they only do it if their fathers are solicitors, which was largely true in those days. I don't think either of us knew that in 1960, when we were having this conversation, women were only 2.3% of more than 19,000 practising solicitors, and only 4.4% of nearly 2,000 practising barristers. Would that have put either of us off if we'd known that? I don't think so. It certainly wouldn't have put me off. But Cambridge did change my life in so many ways. There was, of course, a built-in quota that was deeply unfair to women, which had already been mentioned, 3 colleges for women and 21 colleges for men. It was deeply unfair, but it was seriously beneficial to our social lives. So this was something quite new to a village girl, where the only pastime available had been English country dancing. Right? And on the whole, the women in Cambridge were very conscious of how fortunate we were to be there. The men were different. For the first time, I encountered those confident young men from the top public schools. Aren't they irritating? Yeah. They took it for granted that they would get into Oxford or Cambridge, because that's where their fathers had been, or where everybody from their school went, or whatever, and then they'd go on to a top job in the city. But they did me a favour, because I realised that they had expectations, which I certainly didn't have, but I saw no reason why I shouldn't have them, because I turned out to be at least as good at law as they were. So they did me a favour. I loved life in Cambridge so much that I didn't want to stay there after I graduated. I'm sure you can understand that feeling. It was so good. It couldn't go on being so good, so you have to get out. And also, in 1966, when I graduated, there were no women on the law faculty at Cambridge University. The first woman was appointed to a university teaching post there in 1986, 20 years later. So I was also wise to get out, wasn't I? Because otherwise I'd have been sucked into this very pleasant life with no future. Must have been ambitious, mustn't I? Yeah. Anyway, so what to do? I toyed with being a barrister, but we were still being told, actually wrongly, that in order to succeed at the bar in the 1960s, you had to have connections or money. And I had neither connections or money. Wasn't really true, because the amount of work at the bar was expanding so rapidly that almost anybody who went to the bar in the early 1970s did very well, thank you very much. But we didn't know that then. I thought about becoming a solicitor with a Magic Circle London firm of solicitors, which offered me articles, which was very good of them, because I don't think they'd had a woman before, so they were taking a risk, weren't they? Especially with somebody like me. But I had spent some weeks working there, and I didn't like the work that they were doing. So what to do? And my director of study said, well, you could get a job teaching in a university, straight after graduation. Can't do that these days, but you could do then. And I was offered jobs at both Bristol and Manchester. Now, who in their right minds would choose Manchester rather than Bristol? But I did. And I did because Manchester wanted me to qualify as a barrister and practice part-time at the Manchester Bar, as well as doing my teaching. So I had the best of both worlds. I was able to do that. In those days, you could qualify as a barrister by doing... I bought a self-tuition correspondence course for £20 from the College of Law. And it had nutshells, you all know what a nutshell is, in the 5 subjects that the exams required one to do, model test papers and model answer papers. So I swatted up over a few weeks over the first long back, my teaching career, and I passed the exams. Just shows how easy the exams were in those days. They're not as easy anymore, I may tell you that, and they're a great deal harder work, but I was really lucky. And for the next few years, I was able to practice part-time at the Manchester Bar while teaching my students. By the way, I never was a barmaid. There was some lazy journalist after the prorogation case who looked up my entry in Who's Who, which says practiced at the Manchester Bar. And being so ignorant, they didn't realise that there were actually several hundred barristers practising in Manchester, and I had been one of them. But no, sorry, I never was a barmaid. Yep. But in those days, a general common law practice meant just that. You did a bit of crime, a bit of civil, and a bit of family. And I think such practices still go on in the provinces, but London chambers are increasingly specialist, which means that young people don't get the breadth of experience which we had. But after a few years doing both, I had to choose. The teaching got in the way of the longer, more interesting cases. The cases got in the way of the research and writing that all university teachers have to do. And I chose the university for 3 very good reasons. My husband was also at the Manchester Bar. We'd narrowly avoided being on opposite sides of the same case, rather too often for comfort. But the 3 reasons were, first, seemed like a good idea if one of us had a steady salary. University teachers are not paid much, but they are paid. Whereas at the bar, you often have to wait a long time, and you did in those days, to be paid. And of course, there are fringe benefits about being a university teacher, like maternity leave, pensions, sick leave, and the like, which again, at the bar, you have to find all that for yourself. Secondly, we wanted to have children. It's a great deal easier to combine an academic career with having children, although neither is easy. Don't run away with the idea that it's easy. It takes effort and luck. I hope that the 3rd reason wasn't stage fright, but something more subtle. My husband had fallen in love with the bar. He too had started as an academic and gone to the bar. He couldn't imagine doing anything else. I enjoyed it most of the time, but I'd not fallen in love with it in the same way. So I was perfectly happy to go and do something else while he pursued his dream. So it never occurred to me I'd become any sort of judge. After all, it would have been a pretty silly ambition to have, because the first woman full-time judge was only appointed in 1962. That's the year before I went up to university. She was promoted to the High Court in 1965. She wasn't joined by a second woman until 1974. So aspiring to be a judge would have been a bit sort of silly, really. So having committed myself to an academic life, I had to get my academic show on the road. All academics have to be a bit entrepreneurial in an intellectual sense. And everything that I chose to do led, one way or another, to a public appointment. It wasn't a plan, but it's what happened. The first book I wrote was about mental health law, and I wrote it because there wasn't a textbook which was suitable for the social workers and psychiatrists whom I was trying to educate in their very, very draconian powers to lock people up in psychiatric hospitals. But that led to my first judicial job as a legal chair of mental health review tribunals, deciding whether people should stay locked up in mental hospitals. So that was one thing. I was co-founder of a learned journal, the Journal then of Social Welfare Law, now Social Welfare and Family Law. And that led to my becoming a member of the Council on Tribunals, which was a quango that used to inspect and advise upon all the myriad administrative tribunals that we used to have before the spanking new system introduced in 2004. And I think that that probably led to a tap on the shoulder from the Lord Chancellor's officials to sound me out about becoming an assistant recorder. They decided, they told me, to introduce a bit of diversity into the bench. And they didn't mean gender, although obviously I did tick that box. What they meant was, let's have some academics with practising experience sitting on the bench as well. So that's why they offered it to me. I think I failed the interview because after we'd had this conversation, he'd offered it to me. He said, well, now, Brenda, having met you and having had this conversation, isn't there something you'd rather do? So I'm afraid I said no. And I went back and I consulted my professors. There were 4 of them in Manchester in those days. And 2 of them said, oh, no, you better not do that. It'll get in the way of your academic career. And the other 2, who had lively academic careers but also sat a lot on tribunals, said, oh, yes, of course you've got to do it. And of course you've got to do it. Who would pass up an opportunity like that? To learn to be a judge and see whether you liked it. So that was the next thing. And then there was a big casebook on the family law and society, which I think is what led to somebody ringing me up and saying, there's a job at the Law Commission, why haven't you applied for it? So I thought, well, why haven't I applied for it? Perhaps I better had. Anyway, so that's what led to the Law Commission. So one way or another, all my academic entrepreneurship led to public life. And I then spent 9.5 very happy years at the Law Commission, leading a very effective team. Our biggest project, as you've heard, was the Children Act 1989. We never dreamt that it would become the title of a novel by Ian McEwan and an even better film starring Emma Thompson. If you haven't read the novel or seen the film, I can thoroughly recommend them because, of course, after the Law Commission, I went off to be a High Court judge in the Family Division of the High Court, and they give a not inaccurate picture of what it's like to be a Family Division judge. The Family Division judge who advised Ian McEwan, and I think put him in touch with certain important cases that he feature in the book, always used to say that Emma Thompson made a much more convincing High Court judge than he had ever done. He's actually right, that's true. But there we go. He's a good friend of mine. Yeah. So most of what we recommended at the Law Commission actually became law. We were very privileged in those days. Our chances in family law of our proposals being implemented were pretty good. We did have some proposals on the ground for divorce, which got enacted in a mutilated form in the Family Law Act 1996, but the mutilated form was so unworkable that it was never brought into force and was eventually repealed without having been brought into force. But an almost identical scheme, even more radical than ours, was actually implemented in the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act 2020. So 20 years later, after our proposal. So never say never in law reform. There is always a time is going to come. The longest gap is between our report on blasphemy and the abolition of the crime of blasphemy, which was in 1985, and the abolition of the crime of blasphemy, which is in 2008. I say never. There we go. So that's what led to another tap on the shoulder to become a High Court judge. And so I spent 5.5 happy years in the High Court, mostly dealing with child abduction cases, so sending runaway mothers back to Australia or New Zealand from which they had abducted the children without the other parents' permission, or taking children away from their families because of gross child abuse, deciding whether the child abuse had taken place and then what the consequences were, and sometimes making reluctant mothers make their children see the fathers whom they didn't want to see, and sometimes trying to persuade reluctant fathers to provide properly for their families. So it's pretty oppressive stuff, really. You know, I felt most of the time I was oppressing women, but that was the job. So, how am I doing for time?
You're absolutely fine.
Oh.
If we want 20 minutes for Q&A, you've still got 20 minutes.
Okay, right. Well, the trouble is I've got an awful lot to say here, so I think I'm going to... I would just like to share with you the most interesting case that I had in the family division. And it was a very unusual case about what should happen to the mortal remains of a young man who had been run over by a bus in, I think, Norwich or Ipswich or somewhere in East Anglia. He had been born in Australia to an Aboriginal mother, given up for adoption at birth, and eventually placed with an English family when he was 2, and brought up by this English family, brought back to England, had, I think, a pretty happy life, had a partner and a small daughter, but because of changes in the law in Queensland, which had swung from one extreme to the other, his birth family had been in touch with him, and he'd been to visit them in Australia, and I think he'd found it a pretty shattering experience. Anyway, he was run over by the bus. So there was a battle between his English family, consisting of his partner and his adoptive mother, and his Australian family about what should happen to his mortal remains. The English family at first wanted him cremated and his ashes buried next to those of his adopted father. His Aboriginal family, of course, did not want him cremated. They wanted his body brought back to Australia for his bones to be scattered over their ancestral homelands. Okay, which would you have done? Yeah. Okay, so how many people would have sent him back to Australia? How many people would have kept him here? Wow. How many people haven't the foggiest idea? No, good for you for confessing. Yes. No, that's interesting. It usually works out with the majority of us staying here. And I always hope that I haven't told the story in a particularly biased way. But there was no law. I had to work out what I should take into account in deciding whether it was expedient to supplant his personal representatives, who were his partner as mother of his daughter, who was his next of kin. Find out whether she should be supplanted. And I thought that I had to take into account the interests of the Australian family, the interests of the English family, and above all, the interest of his daughter. And it was the interest of his daughter, really, that tipped the balance, because for her to have lost her father at such an early age and not to have some focus to be reminded of who he was and what he was and so on seemed to me to be the important thing, which is why I decided that. But I often think, well, what if we'd been in Western Australia, in Perth, and the Aboriginal family had, of course, been in Queensland, which is a very, very long way away. So just as difficult, in a way, but the cultural baggage rather different. Anyway, I thought I'd share that case with you because it's such an interesting one. Then, of course, I was promoted to the Court of Appeal. The great attraction for me of the Court of Appeal was that you covered the whole range of civil and family law, and it was often questions of law rather than questions of fact. You weren't deciding the case, you were second-guessing what the poor bloody foot soldier had done at first instance, but there we go, it was good. And then after 5 years in the Court of Appeal, there was another tap on the shoulder to become a Lord of Appeal in Ordinary. There was a great deal of mirth in the chamber when I was sworn in on the 12th of January 2004 to hold office so long as she shall well behave herself therein. Whereas the ordinary life peer who was sworn in at the same time, Lord Treesman, whom I saw just the other day, was not expected to behave himself. But of course, basically, this was because when the Law Lords were invented, they were judges. They were the first paid judges in the House of Lords, which was then the highest court in the land. They held office during good behaviour rather than at Her Majesty's pleasure. And this is a guarantee of judicial independence. That had become redundant when their peerages as Lords of Appeal in Ordinary were converted into ordinary life peerages. And so, they didn't really need to have that. But of course, life being what it is in this country, the tradition lived on. So there we are. But there we go. Law Lords were full members of the House of Lords, but they mostly didn't take part in parliamentary business, although they could, except some of them on legal matters. And they said in 2000 that they wouldn't take part in anything with strong party political ramifications, and they would bear in mind that if they did take part in legislation, they might disqualify themselves from doing the job that they were paid to do, which was to interpret that legislation. And in fact, two of my colleagues were disqualified from sitting on the 3 wonderful cases that we had about the Hunting Act 2004 because they'd voted against it. More fool them, because we had 3 wonderful cases, but there we go. So that was that, and I can tell you about the Hunting Act cases if you want. But by 2004, when I joined, it was already clear that the presence of the highest court in the land in the upper house of Parliament was a constitutional anomaly and wrong in principle. Parliaments pass laws, judges apply and interpret them, and also develop the common law, 2 different tasks. So the Constitutional Reform Act 2005 created the Supreme Court. But we had to wait until 2009 for them to find a suitable building, decount the existing occupants and refurbish it for us. And then the Law Lords became the justices of the Supreme Court and disqualified from sitting in the House of Lords, although we could return once we'd retired from judging. I hadn't played any part in parliamentary business while I was a Law Lord. I couldn't while I was a Justice of the Supreme Court. But when I retired in January 2020, I could, of course, go and play a part in parliamentary business. But then COVID happened, and so it wasn't very convenient to do so. So I have to confess that I made my maiden speech as a parliamentarian in the House of Lords in November last year. I was determined to do it before I had been a member of the House for 20 years. I thought it rather important that I got it in first, but I'm still not really a parliamentarian. And sadly, I was the only woman ever to be a Lord of Appeal in Ordinary. It took until 2017 before a second woman Supreme Court Justice was appointed. I did wonder what I was doing to put them off. Would I go to that special place in hell, reserved for women who don't help other women? Well, I don't think it was that. I think there weren't enough women around, who wanted to do the job. A third woman came along in 2018, so that was a quarter of the court. There are 12 members of the court. But all 3 of us are now retired, and for a while there was only 1 woman on the court. Fortunately, she has just last November been joined by another, but there is still no person of colour on the court. There are many dimensions of diversity. I was different from my 11 brethren in several ways, not just my gender. I went to a state day school, not to an independent boys' boarding school. I practised for a short time at the provincial bar, not the smart London bar. I made my professional reputation as an academic and public servant, not as a top barrister. And it suddenly dawned on me during the hearing of one case, I had been employed, not self-employed, all my working life. And I specialised in poor folks' law, family and social welfare law. So I was different from my brethren in lots of ways, although, of course, I had been to Oxbridge and I was white, which, was a help. But lack of diversity in the judiciary matters for all sorts of reasons. The legitimacy of the administration of justice in a democracy. The court should embody the law's values of justice, fairness and equality. We shouldn't waste the talents of all those able young women and people of colour who are going into the law these days. And, dare it be said, diversity improves decision-making. So that is 4 good reasons for seeking to have a more diverse judiciary. And I can bang on about that for ages, but I'm not going to. Because what I would like just to say a few words about is, why do we have a Supreme Court at all? Isn't 1 tier of appeal enough? No, there's a Court of Appeal in England and Wales, there's the Inner House of the Court of Session in Scotland, there's the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland. Do we need the UK Supreme Court? After all, we can't do what the Supreme Courts in countries with a written constitution can do all over the world, and that is strike down provisions in an Act of the UK Parliament as unconstitutional. So what are we for? Well, I think there are three good reasons to have a UK Supreme Court. The first is that our decisions ought to be better than those of the Courts of Appeal. We hear far fewer cases. The Court of Appeal of England and Wales hears thousands of cases in a year. The Supreme Court hears 70 to 80 a year. We have more help from the lawyers who conduct them and from our own judicial assistants. We can take our time to think things through in principle. We're not bound, and this is probably the most important thing, by the decisions in the courts below, as they are. The Court of Appeal is bound by its own previous decisions, and so they have to spend a huge amount. I don't know, you must all be reading loads of Court of Appeal cases. They go on forever, don't they? And they go on forever discussing what previous Courts of Appeal have decided in trying to reconcile them and make some sense of them. In the Supreme Court, House of Lords, we didn't have to do that. Obviously, we took into account what had gone on, but we didn't have to reconcile them or follow them. And that meant that we could think things through in proper legal principle, not even bound by previous decisions of the House of Lords or the Supreme Court, although we did try hard not to depart from them. And we sat in panels of 5, 7, 9, or on 2 memorable recent occasions, 11. And the theory is that the more heads thinking about a problem, the more robust the answer will be. Well, that's definitely so if they're diverse heads. Perhaps less so if they all have similar life stories, values and thought processes. That's another reason for diversity. I have been known to call my much respected former colleagues the quadrangle to quadrangle to quadrangle boys, because they started in public schools with quadrangles, they went to Oxbridge with quadrangles, they went to the Inns of Court in London with quadrangles, and that was their life. Very unfair, because they were diverse in many, many ways, but nevertheless, they all had that in common. So there we are. But the second reason, apart from that rather vainglorious reason, is that there has to be a top court for the whole United Kingdom. At present, there's one justice system in England and Wales, although there's pressure to have a separate Welsh justice system. Scotland and Northern Ireland have always had separate justice systems. But there's still a lot of law which is common to the whole United Kingdom. Mostly statute law, so tax, social security, immigration and asylum, laws based on international treaties, including human rights law, employment and equality law. There are also areas of the judge-made common law, which everybody agrees ought to be the same throughout the United Kingdom, the law of negligence being the best-known example. You've probably all done tort law, haven't you? Well, as you know, tort law is mainly consisted of Scottish cases. So the law ought to be the same throughout the United Kingdom. And so we need a top court which can reconcile inconsistent decisions between different parts of the United Kingdom and whose decisions are binding throughout the United Kingdom. And then the third reason is that we need a constitutional court for the whole United Kingdom. This has actually been so ever since the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, which set up separate parliaments for the North and South of Ireland and gave them defined but limited powers to legislate. It's been even more so since 1998, when parliaments were set up in Scotland and Wales, again with defined powers to make laws for their own countries. The Supreme Court has to decide whether those laws are within the powers which the UK Parliament has given them. This means that we can strike down provisions in acts of the parliaments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, though we can't strike down provisions in acts of the UK Parliament. And indeed, bills which have not yet received royal assent from those parliaments can be referred to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to rule in advance and in the abstract on whether or not they are good law. A Scottish example was a provision in an act of the Scottish Parliament defining the franchise for the independence referendum. And that act repeated the ban on all sentenced prisoners voting, which Strasbourg had held to be contrary to the Human Rights Convention. So, as the Scottish Parliament is not allowed to legislate contrary to the Human Rights Convention, was that bad law? Well, we actually held that it wasn't bad law because the provision about the franchise didn't apply to referendums. It's a bit of a get out, really, but there we go. There are plenty of other examples. But of course there are other constitutional cases which define the relationship between the three organs of government: Parliament, government and judiciary. And one example, of course, was the first of the Hunting Act cases, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. This is the case in which it was alleged that the Hunting Act was not a proper act of Parliament at all, because it had been passed without the consent of the House of Lords. And it had been passed without the consent of the House of Lords under the procedure laid down in the 1911 Parliament Act, as modified by the 1949 Parliament Act, which had itself been passed under the procedure in the 1911 Parliament Act. You with me? Yep. Well, there you go. And it was said that the revised Parliament, consisting just of the House of Commons and the Queen, as it then was, no, actually it was the King in 1949, couldn't enhance their powers as they did by drastically reducing the time limits for passing without the consent of the House of Lords. So that was the argument which said that it wasn't a proper act of Parliament. Well, we didn't have much trouble in saying that that was all rubbish, and that, yes, it was a proper act of Parliament, not least because it said so in the Parliament Act 1911, that it would become a proper act of Parliament. But, of course, it did raise the question. We were all members of the House of Lords, and this was a battle between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So it seemed pretty strange that people who are all members of the House of Lords should be ruling on a battle between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, even though we had found in favour of the House of Commons, because you're not supposed to be judging your own cause, etc. So that was a nice case for us to deal with. But, of course, the most famous cases recently have been about the relationship between our government and our Parliament. The first case, brought by Mrs. Miller, was about whether the government could give notice to leave the European Union without the approval of Parliament. Treaty making is one of the prerogative powers of the Crown, now exercised by the government. The government can make or unmake any treaty, but the government cannot change the law. Only Parliament can change the law or give the government the power to change the law. So making or unmaking a treaty can't change the law unless Parliament has given the government power to do so. This is long-established constitutional law. So it was alarming, to say the least, to see the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, the Master of the Rolls, who's the second most senior judge in England and Wales, and a senior Court of Appeal judge labelled enemies of the people by a national newspaper, which is respected by many people, simply for reaffirming that basic constitutional law. By the time the case got to the Supreme Court, the argument actually had rather shifted, although the government did still sort of try and muddy the waters, but it had shifted to a difficult question of statutory interpretation. Did the European Communities Act 1972 contain within itself the power to change the whole of the law of England, well, the United Kingdom, simply by withdrawing from the treaties? There's a perfectly respectable argument to that effect, with which 3 of my colleagues agreed. But the remaining 8 did not agree with it, because we couldn't think that Parliament contemplated, when passing the 1972 Act, that it would be possible to come out of the European Union, as it later became, simply by the government and the stroke of a pen. I think that was a question of reality, really. There we go. And, of course, the second case was about whether the Prime Minister could lawfully advise the Queen to suspend the operation of Parliament for 5 weeks out of the 8 remaining before we would automatically drop out of the European Union unless the deadline was extended. Now, some people have said, well, why were we involved in this at all? Well, we had no choice in the matter. There'd been a case brought by Mrs. Miller in England where the Divisional Court had held that this was a political matter over which the courts had no jurisdiction, so it wasn't justiciable. There'd been a case brought in Scotland where the inner house of the Court of Session, that's the Scottish Court of Appeal, had held not only that it was justiciable, but that it was unlawful, void, and of no effect. So the effect of the English decision was that Parliament had been prorogued, and the effect of the Scottish decision was that Parliament had not been prorogued. They couldn't both be right. there's only one Parliament. Either it was or was not still in session. So we had to choose between them. And we pulled out all the stops to do so as quickly as we could, and we agreed with the decision of the Court of Session. So Parliament had not been prorogued. Anybody who was watching this, it took us 3 days to hear the argument, but by the end of the first 2 days, we had heard the main parties on each side of each case. We got some interveners to hear on the third day. But we said at the beginning of the third day, we said to Council, we would like to know more about what you say the consequences are if we say that this decision was unlawful. They had said very little about this up until then, almost as if it was an afterthought. Possibly they weren't even expecting to win the case. So anybody who was actually on the ball, as Clive Coleman, the BBC's legal correspondent, would have realised the way we were going to decide, and the only question was what the consequence was. And that's what we basically worked out, was that if the advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, the ordering council ordering the prorogation of Parliament was unlawful and therefore of no effect. And so when the commissioners walked into Parliament to declare that Parliament was prorogued, it was as if they walked in with a blank sheet of paper. So nothing had happened. And this, of course, meant that nothing had to happen for Parliament to resume. And they did resume the next day. If the consequence had been that something else had to be done, by whom? By somebody in government, goodness knows what it would have happened. But so it was pretty rowdy and pretty undignified, but nevertheless, there they were back. So that is, I think, now it's not a case of pride, because you do not want to be in a situation of having to tell the Prime Minister that what he's done is unlawful. You really do not want to be in that position, especially on such a delicate subject. But there are times when the court's duty is to tell government that it has done something which it doesn't have power to do. And if the courts lose that power, well then the rest is tyranny, I think. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really sorry that I am here rather than in the House of Lords today, because today is the second day of the report stage of the Safety of Rwanda bill, on which the House of Lords is trying to reassert the rule of law in relation to what the government wants to do. And I put my name to certain amendments there. But I was committed to being here, and I'm delighted to be here. So I have no idea what's going on down there, but there we go. Thank you.
We're just going to have some Q&A, so please be ready with your questions whilst Lady Hale gets mic'd up. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I'm charged after this with doing a closing, but I've been so completely enraptured by what you were saying that I have no idea what I'm going to say in a few minutes' time in closing. So please help me out. We've got probably 20 minutes for questions. So first person, you always have to be the brave one to put your hand up first. Excellent. Thank you ever so much. If you could just wait for the mic
Hale,
to come to you.
I'm the Mayor of West Lancashire, and mine isn't really a question. It's to thank you. You're an inspiration, and I'm glad that all these people here are listening to what this lady's done. Amazing. I have my granddaughter here with me today. Studied here, graduated as a nurse, and she's just got her first nursing job. But you. And I hope you look at her, Amelia, is amazing, and you can all do what you want to do. I've met some women like you in my time, unfortunately no longer here, but I'd just like to say thank you so much. Inspirational, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So is your granddaughter your Lady Mayoress?
She's my Lady Mayoress.
Oh, how wonderful. Congratulations. Yes. Yeah.
We brought her today.
Yeah. Terrific. Thank you
very
so much.
If you
Yeah.
could just say your name and...
Sorry, my name is George Turner, and thank you again very much for a really great talk. That was superb. My question really is this. It's something that's always bothered me about the purpose of a trial. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So is the purpose of a trial really to find out the truth, however messy it is? Or is the purpose of a trial to come to some clear decision that everyone can tend to agree with? Now, I agree it can be both of those things, but if you had to put your money on one, which would you prefer?
It would depend which sort of trial you're talking about. If you're talking about a criminal trial, the purpose of a criminal trial is to decide whether it has been proved beyond reasonable doubt that the accused is guilty of the offence offences of which the accused is. That means that, no, you are not going to find out the whole truth, however messy it is. Large parts of the truth are not admissible in evidence, and in any event, the trial is not designed to produce the whole of the truth. It is designed to answer that one question, yea or nay. Except in Scotland, where they have a verdict called not proven, which I think that's different. A family trial, on the other hand, if it has to do with the future of a child, is designed to find out what is going to be best for that child in the future. Now, by definition, the child has had a troubled time, whether it's because the family is split up, whether it's because there's been abuse, or whatever. So it's not going to be the perfect childhood, but you're trying to find the best childhood, and you're trying to feed into that decision as much information as you possibly can. And there aren't strict rules of evidence and so on, and so you can get as much information as you can. So yes, it's messy. And I don't think with either sort of trial, people are necessarily going to agree. I mean, people won't always agree that somebody's convicted should have been convicted. They won't always agree that somebody who's acquitted should have been acquitted. They won't always agree with whatever decision the family judge comes to about what should happen to the children. So I don't think you ever get... But what you have to try and do is have a fair process, a relevant process, and a well-reasoned process so that people can at least understand why you have decided what you have decided. And of course there's a third sort of trial, which is a civil trial, which is somewhere between the two extremes that I've just mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you. There's a potentially quite fascinating programme on at the moment, isn't there, which I haven't watched yet, but it's the criminal case where they've got 3 parallel juries, each hearing the... 2, is it? Right, OK, you can tell I've not watched it. So they're each hearing the same evidence and actually the analysis of how they reach the decision. So it will be fascinating, I'm sure, to watch that one. OK, thank you very much. Question here at the front. Thanks. Just the lady there in the mustard coat, and I'll come to you at the back.
I just want to think, I genuinely think you're a really amazing inspiration. I was just wondering how, obviously, as a woman, you were able to, cope with, running a family and having children, meanwhile, achieving your own goals. Is there anything you kind of did to help you with that?
Well, thank you. I did only have one child, and I have observed that many women are able to go on with demanding full-time careers with one child, but it gets exponentially more difficult. So I hugely admire those of my colleagues who've managed to have successful practices at the bar with having 2, 3 or more children, and some of them have. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg always used to say that the most important decision that she made in her life was to marry Marty. In other words, she found the right man to marry, because he was one of those, well, in my generation, quite rare men. I'm sure they're not rare in your generation, who actually didn't mind having a clever career woman as a wife. And you really do need, the best guarantee of being able to do it is a supportive partner. It also helps to be in a lucrative line of practice, because then you can afford all the childcare that you need and so on and so forth, and you can afford to live in a convenient place rather than a very inconvenient place. So, and actually most of the women I know who have had several children, mostly they have been in lucrative areas of practice. So, but you have to go for what suits you. You have to go for what suits you and what you enjoy. And don't think it'll be easy, but believe it's always going to be possible.
Great advice, thank you. And no, there was a hand up towards the back there. Sorry, Paul, yeah. A race between you to get there, I think.
Thank you, Lady Hale. Thank you for coming to Edge Hill today. We're a group of staff and students from the Social Work Department, in which we engage in much dialogue in relation to human rights, as you would expect. My question for you is, if you were to offer advice to our students, not just social workers, but people from the Faculty of Health, Social Care, Medicine, Law, and from across the university, as to how they might keep human rights at the centre of their practice, what would that advice be?
That's a very, very good question, and I'm not often asked that. So I haven't got a perfect answer off the top of my head. I think absolutely the first thing is, do not believe all this rubbishing of human rights that's going on in politics at the moment and in the media. Human rights is based on the principle that each person, each human being, has inherent dignity and value equal to that of anybody else. So the principle of equal dignity is underneath the whole principle of human rights. And of course there are many forces in the world that are wanting to deny the principle of equal dignity. So I think that is something to keep in one's head the whole time. And I find it incomprehensible that people don't like that idea. It seems totally basic to modern Western philosophy and, dare I say it, religion. Not only the religion in which I was brought up, but other religions too. So I find it very upsetting, when I hear politicians rubbishing human rights or being reticent about it, not standing up for it. So carry on standing up for human rights. Yes.
Yeah, we probably could do with you in the Lords today, to be fair, but we're very, very happy you're here. The question there at the back, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Hale. I was just asking, you're clearly very passionate, you've spoken about politics and you're now a parliamentarian. Did you find it really difficult going to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court to always be apolitical and outside of the media line around politics?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I have never thought of myself as a political animal. I've never been a member of any political party. I have, I think, voted for all three of the main parties at some stage in some election in my life. So I don't think of myself as having a fixed political line. And neither do most of my colleagues. We could honestly say, and I was discussing this with one of my predecessors, Lord Phillips, not very long ago, we could honestly say to the rest of the world that we did not know the politics of our, if any, of our colleagues. Most of them, I suspect, were floating voters of one sort or another, because we all, as lawyers, found it quite difficult to sign up to the manifesto of any one political party, the total lot. I only had two colleagues where I could be pretty certain what their politics were. One of them because he had been Solicitor General for Scotland in a Conservative administration, so that was a pretty good ode. And the other because he's Lord Sumption. It's all right. He and I are good friends. We get on very well together, although we disagree on quite a lot.
Quite often, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That's a
it
thing.
does. Oh, yes, he does. He does. Yes. But he wrote a book with Keith Joseph called Equality in the 70s. He wasn't talking about equality and diversity as we talk about it. He was talking about economic equality, and he was against it.
Next question. Over to the side. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. So aside from rubbishing of human rights in politics, we quite also hear a lot of rubbishing of the value of a university education. And I wondered to what extent you're hopeful about increasing or improving the diversity of those entering the law profession.
Well, entry to the law profession, it's pretty good on diversity. The number of women qualifying as solicitors is greater than the number of men. It's about 60%. The number qualifying as barristers is about 50-50. There are large numbers of people of colour entering both, probably slightly higher than the proportion in the general population. I haven't checked it recently, but I think it probably is. The profession is also now much more disability friendly than it was. I mean, courts are now accessible. When I started out, most courts were full of steps, which made it pretty difficult for a wheelchair user to become a judge. But, you know, there are now blind judges, there are deaf judges, there are wheelchair using judges, and so on. There was a time, probably until the 90s, when to be gay, at least as a man, was regarded as a disqualification for becoming a judge. Not entirely sure why, something to do with blackmail or whatever. But of course, now we have many gay judges, including Lord Etherton, who was Master of the Rolls until he retired, who's very upfront and vocal about the whole thing. So I think on diversity entry, we're not doing badly. We're still not doing as well as we should on appointment to the judiciary and appointment to the senior judiciary. So although women, there are more than half tribunal judges are women, I think. They're not yet up to half or even quite 40% in the courts judiciary, but there are more in the lower ranks of the judiciary than there are in the higher ranks, and that's why I was mentioning the fact that the Supreme Court has found it difficult to recruit enough women. I think, I did have the figures, but they're not immediately in my head, but I think it's probably about between 25 and 30% now in the High Court and the Court of Appeal. So there's been a huge increase over this century. Not doing so well on ethnicity. The numbers have gone up a bit over the last 10 years, but that has usually been people of South Asian heritage. The number of judges of black, African or African Caribbean heritage has not gone up since 2014, and it is very low. So there are different barriers in different ethnicities that have to be looked at and worked out, because there are plenty of able people around who ought to be thinking of or being. I think a lot of them don't think of it. But I think there are also some reports that suggest there is some failure to recognise merit where merit is, in that dimension in particular. So there is work to be done. I'm not too complacent about it, but the one thing I do think that has changed dramatically over this century, the 2 decades of this century, is that people do realise that it is necessary to do something. You know, you can't just wait. You've got to be a bit more proactive than that. And I don't mean positive discrimination, I mean just being proactive about looking at your selection processes and seeing if they are genuinely doing the right thing.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and you get the golden ticket at the front here. Oh, thank you. Just wait for the mic to come down. Thank you.
It has been an absolute delight to listen to your speech today. Thank you very much. And I am aware the previous before me have presented questions of great magnitude. However, I'd like to ask a question about the importance of the royal assent and the House of Lords. And if you believe that less power or more power should be given to the royal assent, or less power or more power should be given to the House of Lords.
Oh, what a lovely question. How long have we got? I don't myself think that we should go back 3 centuries and make royal assent a genuine choice in the monarch. I think the last monarch to refuse assent to an Act of Parliament was Queen Anne, so it's a long time ago. The question of the House of Lords is a really interesting one, because it's one of those institutions which is very, very difficult to defend in principle, but when you actually watch it and compare it with the House of Commons, it does a job that the country needs it to do. And it does it because the power of the political parties is nothing like as strong in the House of Lords as it is in the House of Commons. I mean, any vote in the House of Commons of any importance is going to be whipped. Well, votes in the House of Lords are whipped too. I mean, I took part in 5 of them. No, it wasn't 5 because I wasn't there for the last 2. But anyway, on Monday. And clearly there were whips going on and there were lots of people around. But if you defy the whip, nothing very much happens. You know. So, and also, members of the House of Lords are there for life, although they can retire. So they are not as enthralled to their party as people in the Commons are. Now, some people, of course, regard that as a bad thing, but actually others regard it as a good thing. It means they can bring an independent mind to things. Many members of the House of Lords do not take a party whip at all, the crossbenchers, and they tend to be people who've done something serious in their lives before they became members of the House of Lords, you know, whether they're former chiefs of the general staff, former top doctors, former top lawyers, former top this, that and the other. They're an amazing bunch of people, the crossbenchers, and they bring experience and wisdom and knowledge to the House, which people who spent all their lives in politics don't necessarily bring. So as a revising chamber to try and improve legislation before it reaches the statute book that goes for royal assent, they do a much better job than the House of Commons does. And they can also do some quite useful inquiries. I think they did a useful job on the Rwanda Treaty, because treaties don't have to be ratified by Parliament, but they have to be laid before Parliament, and Parliament can say to the government, well, we don't think you should be ratifying it. The House of Lords had a brilliant debate on the Rwanda Treaty and came out with a vote that said you shouldn't be ratifying it for the following very good reasons. So they can do all of this, and I've been there in question time quite a lot. You feel quite sorry for these junior ministers who have to come along and answer questions, and it takes up an awful lot of their time, and it must be a real nuisance. But they are asked questions, and they do have to explain what's going on. So there's a level of accountability which there wouldn't otherwise be. And if we are to say, well, the House of Lords as it's currently constituted, so it's got 26 bishops, it's got 92 hereditary peers, and then it's got a variety of people. I mean, I'm a completely random person because I had to be a member of the House of Lords in order to be a member of the top court in the United Kingdom. I wouldn't otherwise be a member of the House of Lords, but that's why I am. So there are odd random people like me. And then a lot of other political nominations, some of whom are excellent and some of whom are not. One of the questions that was asked, I mean, all sorts of funny things go on there. I mean, I'm not there very often, but I do find it very amusing when I go. We had an environmental question about pollution and so on, and we had just had 2 new peers introduced into the House, both of them Tory donors. And so somebody from Labour got up and said, what's going to be done to reduce the flood of Tory donors joining this House? So you see, there are benefits to it, and I suspect that the trouble is, to make it legitimate, it would have to have an element of democratic election. So how do you devise an electoral system which is not then going to set it up in opposition to the Commons? So one feels that it's going to be pretty difficult to persuade the Commons that any sizable reform of the House of Lords would actually be a good idea. So,
amazing, thank you. I'm afraid we do not have any more time for questions. So it just remains for me to say, I think, well, possibly like me, you came in here today expecting to hear some really, really interesting insights into an exemplary life in the legal profession. What I didn't come in today expecting was a bit of an emotional roller coaster, actually. Some of the things that you've said have been, have made me feel quite emotional about the work that you've done. And, I mean, others have said, you are an absolute inspiration to women, to men, to young people, to old people, to people of different ethnicities. Your passion for equality and, the phrase that you used around every individual being a human being and being, it is obvious to you, it's palpable to you, but unfortunately is not obvious to everyone. And the candour, the humility, the humour that with which you've spoken today has been just absolutely enrapturing, is the word. And fearlessness came across to me really, really strongly, which you sort of look quizzical about that, but in everything that you do, you appear fearless. I don't know whether it's always felt that way, or you've just felt like, actually, I must do the right thing for my own integrity. But that seems to be what absolutely characterises everything that you've done. And I was reflecting, I'd forgotten it actually. I was a law student from 1987 to 1990. So we were tracking the passing of the Children Act, actually. And I then I was articled in local government, and I was in children's care as a trainee. And we were looking at the Children Act in action then. And the key thing, the big phrase that everybody was using was about the interests of children being paramount. And it was really the first time that had been a thing. Well, of course the interests of children should be paramount, but it had never been articulated in that way. And that has your stamp all over it, I have to say. And the story that you told around the mortal remains, I think, is illustrative of that. When you've got such a difficult decision to take, and you think, who are the people, who are the shoes that I should stand in making this decision? And actually, it was just clear to you, there's one person here that needs to be paramount, and it was the child. And that, I was just like, it really did make me quite emotional. You are an absolute inspiration. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us today and the work that you have done in creating a better society. It really does make a difference. And I think very far from there being a special place in hell for you, for a woman who has not helped women. I think it must be a very, very special place for you, which is hopefully a very, very long way off in heaven, for a woman who has helped very, very many people in society who come from less privileged backgrounds of all types. So thank you for your time. It's been incredible. Thank you.